Neira te mihi whakatau I a koutou katoa, kua tūhonohono mai I tēnei ata, I runga I te reo karanga o te matapunga o te Kotahi, o te rā I runga I te karanga o tō tātou kaupapa, nāna nei tātou I whakakotahi, ara ko te rangahau Kaupapa Māori tēnā. Nā reira, kia koutou, I ngā tauira o mai te kupenga, kia koutou katoa, e mātakitaki mai ana, nau mai, haere mai, whakatau mai. Kia koe Linda, tēnā koe, mō tō whakai, kia tū hei manu kōrero I tēnei ata, nō mātou te tino whiwhi, nā reira tēnā koe te maraukura. Ko wai tēnei, e mihi kawana kia koutou katoa, he uri tēnei, no Taranaki, me ki, he tātarakihi, no roto parihaka, ko Joeliee Seed-Pihama tōku ingoa. Nā reira I titi, e te rahi, tēnā tātou katoa. So I'm really honoured and privileged to welcome you all here this morning to the second webinar of the Tikanga Rangahau series. And we're really privileged this morning to have Professor Linda Tuhiwai Smith here to talk with us. And just before we start though, just want to mihi to our major sponsors, Ngā Pai o te Māramatanga, and Mai Te Kupenga, underneath that, as well as Ako Aotearoa, just to remind you all to, if you haven't already, to please register for this webinar today. You can do that by clicking on the link in the description box below the YouTube clip. And if you could do that, it's just so that we can engage better with you really, and know where you're all listening from. And also throughout the kōrero, if you can please send your questions through at any time, but we will allow some Q&A at the end of Linda's kōrero. And also to our webinar host, Rau Matatini, tēnā koutou as well. So at this point, I think I'd like to hand over to Linda, who will lead us in conversation around Kaupapa Māori methodology.
Tēnā koe Joeliee, tēnā koutou katoa. It's going to take me a couple of minutes to warm up to this technology, but we'll see how we go. I've sort of divided our session into, well, three parts. So firstly, I want to talk about Kaupapa Māori, particularly around research, but broader than that. Then move to talk about decolonizing and Indigenous methodologies. And then Joeliee and I are going to have a conversation, because Joelie's my most recent PhD graduate. So hopefully Kaupapa Māori is fresh in her mind about, hopefully our conversation will help those of you who are struggling with, how does this work for you in your research and in your thesis in practical ways. So I want to start by following up from Leonie's talk last week, in which she really focused on the importance of theory as a site of struggle. And for those of us who have an education background, theory indeed is a key site in which ideas and theories about Māori, about Native peoples more broadly, have really framed the way that we understand curriculum, schools, teaching, the structure of schooling, the relationship between schooling, legislation, and community. And educational theories are often invisible when you are in the classroom or when you are a student. You don't realise how much of what you are exposed to is all about theory. And so that's one of the reasons it was important to push back against that. A practical example of theory, theories of intelligence. Theories of intelligence were often sourced in theories about race and racial superiority. So anytime, the word intelligence is applied or not applied to an Indigenous population, it's informed by these theories about race. And so we can't just take, theories for granted. And engaging in theory, therefore, has been a really important, but often invisible struggle in which academics have been involved. I want to step a little bit down from the theoretical aspects to talk about Kaupapa Māori in terms of research and what it means for understanding research, thinking about research, and then developing your own research frameworks. So I want to start with the idea of Kaupapa Māori. And I guess first acknowledge I come out of a particular tradition of Kaupapa Māori, which is the education and the schooling alternative of Kura Kaupapa Māori. But there are other traditions. So Kaupapa Māori research is also used in health and across other disciplines. But, my first introduction to the term Kaupapa Māori and why it was such a cool term to use was in the work we did in Tāmaki around trying to develop Kura Kaupapa Māori. So I was in the room, in the committee, in the meetings where we actually decided that that was the term we wanted to use for our kura Kaupapa Māori. And we had some very specific reasons for doing that. Every time we went to talk to the Department of Education about our alternative school, they would always start by saying, now about your bilingual school, and we would go, no, we're not a bilingual school. We're a kura, and we do more than bilingualism. It's not just about translating the curriculum or schooling practice into te reo. It was about an approach to schooling. It was about a philosophy of education. It was about what we were trying to produce, if you like, in our children. What kind of child did we want to produce through schooling? So we came to the term Kura Kaupapa Māori. It did sort of bring a smile on our faces when officials were forced to use that term and use all the syllables involved in that term. So we did have a kind of wicked sense of humour about that. But the kaupapa aspects of Kura Kaupapa Māori were really to kind of think about schooling as not just this translation of the same exact type of schooling, which we rejected, but done in te reo Māori, because we didn't see that as transformative, that would just continue to colonise us in our own language. So we saw the term kaupapa as meaning a number of things. For example, just a way that we did things as Māori. But it also meant a way of being, what it means to be Māori, to be a Māori teacher, to be a Māori student, to be a Māori parent. Those are three significant subjectivities in education. And we wanted those subjectivities or identities to be clearly grounded in our Māoriness. And we understood our Māoriness was diverse, and changing all the time. It also, means, the term kaupapa can also mean a platform or a proposal or a plan for doing something. And that, in a way, was also important because we didn't really know where we were going, all right? We knew what we wanted to do, and we knew that we had to go somewhere different from where we were at that time. And I'm talking really about the mid-1980s. That standing still was insufficient. And in fact, standing still meant going backwards. So we knew we had to kind of break open this new pathway. But of course, we couldn't predict where it would take us. All we knew is we had to go on this journey, and it had to be grounded in this kaupapa of, that sort of helped shape the principles that we would use in our approach. And so in that sense, it was a statement of commitment. And you would often hear it around in the community, like, are you on the kaupapa? Which can be a bit of a burden, because sometimes you're thinking, oh, what kaupapa is that? But it's this kind of idea of, are you committed? Are you, is there a commitment to this, or are you just going to stand on the fence? Are you just going to criticise? Are you waiting for the perfect model to come up? And we were realistic enough to know you can't create perfect models out of nothing. And humans cannot ever create perfect models, because humans are not perfect. But what's important, and what's radically important, is that you have to stand up and try, right? You can't be defeated. You have to try. And if you fall over, you pick yourself up and you try again. And that's the story of learning. But it's also the story of Māori education, is just to keep trying. It's more than just being resilient, it's being resistant, it's being creative, it's being stubborn, it's being inventive, it's been sort of spontaneously, some sort of genius moment that we have, and then other times it's trying to entrench things, secure things, become more stable. So there's a number of dynamics. And I think ultimately, the term kaupapa is around this set of practices of being Māori. What does that mean in, the 21st century? So to me, the term Kaupapa Māori is really important to understand it as a term that has multiple dimensions. It's used in different ways, but actually it's also a really ordinary term that you can hear when Māori people get together. They'll talk about their kaupapa, or they'll ask a question about what kaupapa are you on, or, and I think grounding it in our language and grounding it in what I would regard as a kind of ordinary term, it's really important, because, at that time it was about ensuring that education in particular was accessible to our people, that it wasn't elitist and it wasn't privileged, that it was trying to be inclusive, even though at that time not that many Māori, even those who are coming out of kohanga, were seeking an alternative path. They loved kohanga, but then their children would go to a mainstream school. Some were able to set up bilingual schools, but in Auckland we found very few bilingual schools. Richmond Road was one of the few that would take our children, but even then it was not what we were seeking. We were seeking something radically different. And I think it's important, in my tradition of thinking about Kaupapa Māori research, to go back to those touchstones. It is about seeking something radically different, and being committed to that, and being on the journey of where that might take us. So if I sort of fast forward now to think, to connect with what Leonie was talking about last week, and I just want to re-emphasise some of her points, that, Kaupapa Māori as an approach kind of sees these critical terms in research as important sites of struggle over knowledge, that it's about claiming our right, not only our right to know, but our right to claim and reclaim that we are a knowledge people, that our people valued knowledge, and that if we look back in our traditions, it's the story of a people who have claimed, developed, thought about knowledge, and have used knowledge in really powerful ways. And if we go back to our Pacific roots, the example I use is we didn't accidentally fall out of some waka in Aotearoa. For us to have travelled across the Pacific, and then in particular to have travelled deliberately in waka with men and women to come here wasn't a feat of just being adventurous. It wasn't a feat of an accidental voyage. It was the feat of people who knew what they were doing. And so if we go back to some of our touchstones, if we go back to our cosmology, to the story of Rangi and Papa, to the story of Tāne Nui Rangi, then it's a story of valuing knowledge. And I think those are the roots that we always have to go back to. And remember that, our legacy, if you like, is to defend that and to continue to develop it. So Kaupapa Māori is also a way of theorising our own experiences, our own struggles, our own ideas, our own sort of debates that we have within our own communities. I think one of the challenges in the academy in particular is you're always either learning, engaging in, and fighting against intellectual traditions that aren't really our own. And sure, they're interesting and some of them are relevant and some of them you think, oh, wow, that's a good idea to think about. But in one sense, they're always going to be abstract unless we can apply them in our own day-to-day lives. And not many theories really are about, prior to Indigenous and Kaupapa Māori theories, that put us as theory makers, theory creators. We were always being theorised about. So there's this abundance of literature about us, about Native people, about, race, about this. And so the agency, if you like, there's a question of agency in theory. Who are the theorists? Who theorises? And that was not something available to me, certainly when I was a student on this journey, that we could be theorisers. Right? It's just not that was not a position, intellectual position that one could take. That we could theorise as individuals, and that our people could theorise as a people. So I think the theory part is really important. So I do urge that you go back and read or listen to Leonie's talk from last week. All right, so if we get to the research now, I want to stay, in terms of Kaupapa Māori, stay in the broader sense of Kaupapa Māori at present, and still a little bit more abstract, not coming down into methods. But think about, I tend to talk about Kaupapa Māori research as an approach to research. It's also a methodology, and a methodology is simply a theory of method. It is your theory for the methods you choose. And so in some disciplines, they don't use methodology as the term, they use theory. In other disciplines, they use method. Regardless, you need to know why you're choosing the methods that you choose. And it's not even why you choose the particular tools. It's, it's in a way, it's where do you think knowledge is sourced? When you go out as a researcher to seek knowledge, why do you seek it in the places you seek it? If you go, for example, to the library and you're going to read literature, what does that tell you about seeking knowledge? All right, that you're seeking text-based knowledge, that you're seeking it in these, magnificent institutions that have acquired knowledge through text. If you go and interview someone, you're seeking knowledge from that individual. Why? What is it that you think they have got that will help you build this knowledge? If you do it through a survey, why? What is it you think a survey can tell you? So to me, the theory of your method is how you think about ideas around knowledge, the seeking of knowledge, the ideas you might have about reality, the ideas you might have about truths, where you might find truths, where you might find stories, where you might find insights. And so that's why I think it's always important to stay at that broad approach first before thinking, right, here's my question, here are my methods, and I'm just going to do it. That little piece between it's not even between the question and the method. Kaupapa Māori begins with the question. It begins with how you even frame up what it is you're looking for. Because the way you do that begins to kind of starts you on a particular pathway. For example, if you have a question that's already deficit-based, right? So let's think of an education question. You know, a common one would be around Māori achievement. If your very first question is, why don't Māori achieve better? That pretty much already frames the kind of approach that you're taking. Because the critical word in that is, and the agency is around Māori. What's wrong with Māori? What's going on with Māori? If you ask a question, that same question in another way, which is, what are the conditions of achievement for Māori? Then it puts the question around something else, the conditions. If you ask, what are teachers doing to support Māori achievement, then you're putting the emphasis on the teacher. So framing the question is really important. It doesn't even need to be a question. It can be a set of ideas, but how you frame them. And to me, a Kaupapa Māori approach in research starts with that framing of the question. And why is that framing important? A, because the path unfolds from that question, but also forces you to ground the question in a kind of Māori worldview. Ground the question by standing on a Māori platform. So you're not looking from the outside at Māori, you are in it with Māori. And I just think those positions that you take it should give you confidence in your question, but it also helps sort out what's in the foreground and then what's in the background and what is out of the frame. So if you think of a frame, all right, you want, part of what framing does is help you figure out what's in the frame. It also helps you decide what's outside of the frame. So it's a very practical way of trying to contain your research. There's another sort of element of Kaupapa Māori research, which, is also, I notice in some work that I read, people are a little bit anxious about the sort of the critical theory and political aspects of Kaupapa Māori. And, I've got a very simple approach to that. I think everything we do in research is political. And I don't have any issues around thinking about that and saying that that's an important element of Kaupapa Māori research. Why? Well, political just means it's about power relations, and it's about being clear and realistic around the relations of power that involved when we get into research. And it's multidimensional. There's the sort of major relations of power between Māori and the state, or Māori and the crown, Māori and colonialism. But even at a practical level, relations of power exist in research when you are the researcher working with whoever. All right. So even though, as you might think, well, I'm just a student, I have no power. Taking on the role of researcher gives you an identity that's imbued with power. And the power that you have as a researcher is to ask questions. That is your power. And that's actually really important kind of dimension of research you need to always think about. It's the basis of anything you do in the ethical space as well, that you have the power to ask questions. And it's not like you're a child, you know, children ask questions and they can be curious and that's fine, they can do what they want, but you're taking on a semi-professional role of asking questions. And then when people begin to answer your questions, or not even, you know, human subjects, but the literature answers your questions, you take on another powerful role, and that's the power to interpret knowledge. So then you've got this other layer of power, which is an interpretative power. In other words, you have the power to make sense of what you read, what you hear, and what you think about. And so those dimensions of politics, I think, are always present. The critical sort of theory aspects of Kaupapa Māori, you know, ask some really basic questions, which is, you know, what is your research about? Who does it benefit? How does this research transform the status quo? Does it simply reinforce the status quo? You know, whose business are you doing? Like, are you just supporting the current power relations, or are you trying to do research that dislodges those relations of power, unsettles them, disrupts them, transforms them? And it doesn't matter whether your research is really tiny or really large. I think those questions are always in the room for a Kaupapa Māori researcher. So in a sense, what I've also hinted at, that Kaupapa Māori is also an ethical position that you take in relation to research, that you take as a researcher, understanding the power that you have and being able to sort of think through that, the way you mediate that power, the way you're respectful, the way you build relationships. You know, when you read the wider Indigenous literature, those are key principles of Indigenous research ethics: relationality, reciprocity, respect, the sort of 3 R's. So let me see how I'm going. So just a few more aspects, and then I'm going to turn shortly to thinking more about decolonizing methodologies. So just some key points I want to make, because in the literature I see other terms being used. So I'll just say these fairly simply. I see Kaupapa Māori research as being more than research which is Māori friendly. All right, because we're not necessarily trying to do friendly research. I don't know what friendly research is. But really what we want to do is engage Māori with research in ways that's meaningful and in ways that give us more control. And in other words, control of the framing of the research, and not just, and all the way through to the methods, but not just the methods. I see Kaupapa Māori as being more than Māori-centred research, which is another term I use. And that's because I think Kaupapa Māori has a more explicit aspiration to transform research and not just put Māori in the centre of existing paradigms. I personally think that's an impossibility, to be in the centre of an existing non-Māori paradigm, because I think it's hard to get into the centre of those paradigms. By definition, they don't allow us in the centre, but also by being in the centre, we have transformed it. All right, so to me, it's Kaupapa Māori makes that a kind of a mission to transform, as opposed to just be in it and not attempt to change it. I think Kaupapa Māori is not just about qualitative research, although most of my research is qualitative. I do want to acknowledge, my colleagues who work in the quantitative space, and the bigger question is, how does Kaupapa Māori approaches, or how does the Kaupapa Māori approach make a positive difference for Māori? And sometimes that means applying quantitative approaches and even standard scientific methods for a particular purpose. I think the key aspect of Kaupapa Māori is in it is in the framing of your question. And I also think Kaupapa Māori research has to be Māori-led. That's often a debate, and it's often a question I get asked, is it okay if non-Māori be part of Kaupapa Māori research methods, and Leonie's way clearer on this position than I am, but I do think Kaupapa Māori has to be led by Māori, and not just any old Māori, it has to be led by ones who actually know what they're doing. In other words, good Kaupapa Māori researchers. So I don't, I've seen a couple of proposals recently where the lead was switched between a non-Māori to a Māori. And I thought, well, you just think that you don't need to be trained to be a researcher. You can't just switch the lead, thinking, it's just replacing a researcher with a Māori, who's good in their area but are not trained in research, because I don't think it positions them well. So I think that's kind of tricky as well. So those are some kind of important elements of Kaupapa Māori that I want to make. And just to reinforce that before this next piece, so it should, to me, Kaupapa Māori is also how we think about what we do and how we work within tikanga Māori spaces. And having said that, I don't want you to think tikanga Māori is this kind of fixed and rigid interpretation of the way we do things. I think even that is very fluid, and it's how often we negotiate our presence and our participation and our own use of tikanga Māori. So that's always at play as a dynamic. Our culture is vibrant, complicated, messy. I like messy. Some people like it all to be neat and contained. But I think if you can live with the messiness, you can live with the actual dynamic of being a Māori today. Governance and management in research is important. A code of, how we conduct ourselves. To me, being an ethical researcher and a Kaupapa Māori researcher are the same thing in the way I think about it. To be a good Kaupapa Māori researcher is to have ethical integrity in the Māori space, and to be thinking about ethics all the time. And just, another little example, I've had community people say to me, we don't need to do ethics because we're from this community and they're all our relations. And that alarms me. I have like bells going off, bing, 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 around that kind of notion, because the moment you become a researcher, you're not just a relation. Right, because it goes back to this role of the power of asking questions, the power to interpret, the power even to get in the door. So it doesn't matter how close you are to someone. In fact, the closer you are, the more hypersensitive you need to be around ethical practices, because things change, relationships change, and researchers can inadvertently change fundamental personal relationships if they stuff up. So I do think that's important, having your own, building your sort of own code of practice. And it's simple to build that as a researcher. You just look in the mirror every day and ask yourself, are you doing a good job? Can you look at yourself in terms of the decisions you've made? And sometimes those decisions, you do make hard ones. You do have to call something. And they do cause you to be awake at night thinking about it. But ultimately you have to live with it. And therefore it has to be purposeful. Can't be a sort of whimsical decision, and it can't be based on loose ideas. You have to make a principled decision. And, finally, I think what Kaupapa Māori research should do is affirm Māori identity. It affirms our value system, affirms who we are. Because if it can't do that, then it's been a waste of time, in my view. So hopefully that's been helpful, but I want to now turn and do this in a visual way. I'm going to turn to a PowerPoint, which I had a lot of fun producing for Victoria, a talk I've done at Victoria University last week, and it's all on book covers. All right, so this first slide really takes us into the decolonizing research and theory space. And here on this slide are some of the, icons of the decolonial literature, Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, Paulo Freire, and Malcolm X, Angela Davis. There was an era of amazing writing that came sort of into the West, because some of these were originally written in French, that sort of helped people like me develop our ideas about what does it mean to decolonize. How do we figure that piece out? Because it's not just about changing the flag from one country and putting up the new flag of your people. Just that very act is symbolic, but changing the institutions of a colonial power and building up new Indigenous institutions is a really difficult thing to do. Going backwards to Indigenous institutions that existed prior to colonialism is also difficult to do. So colonialism disrupts in such significant ways that the whole process of decolonization is this holistic kind of political, social, psychological, spiritual process. And you never go backwards. A country has to go forwards with many of the tools that the colonizers have left behind, which seemed harmless or neutral at the time. But as a new people or as a new country starts to decolonize, what they realize is those tools, for example, the legal system, are so stacked against what their aspirations are that they can't do some of the things that they were hoping to do. So these writers in this space were very important. And I guess there's a number of political or decolonial philosophies in here which are always worth bearing in mind. So Frantz Fanon, for example, saw basically the mission of those working in decolonisation is to get rid of colonisation. It was really simple, get rid of it. But he also understood it because he was a psychiatrist as essentially a very violent process. He was talking about a revolution, but it's also psychologically violent, spiritually violent. It breaks down people's paradigms of being. That's in the end what colonisation does, breaks down our paradigms of being. but decolonisation does that too. And that process is violent because it strips away everything you might have known about yourself. And so that's one of the many points that he makes. But Paulo Freire, who was writing much later than Fanon, and from a completely different context, particularly in pedagogy of the oppressed, he makes the point that the role of the oppressed is to humanise the oppressor. So the role of the colonised is to humanise the coloniser. And what he recognises, and they both do recognise this, is in order to have a colonised people, you have to have a coloniser people. So those two categories are locked into each other. And what Freire was thinking about was, how do you unlock the coloniser? And so he put that responsibility onto the oppressed, that the oppressed, one of their roles is to humanise the oppressor. And when you think about that in our context, that's really hard. It's hard because there's more of them than there is of us. It's hard because we've got our own work to do. It's hard because it's hard work, working with the coloniser population. And the only way you can really do it is to build the kind of alliances where others can do that. But, a lot of people who work in the treaty space, for example, are trying to educate others in order to create and make the spaces that we occupy more viable. So that's why that literature is important. I want to move it forward. Okay, so this one, I'm asking another set of questions. These are all about education, and I guess they show some of the intellectual journeys that we've had to make as researchers. So this book here, A Civilising Mission, Judith Simon, who I worked with at Auckland, had a major project which involved a number of Māori working really in relationship, because Judith was a Pākehā, and we interviewed a number of people who attended or who taught at either the native or Māori schooling system. And it was really understanding the role of education in the colonial process, and trying to see in very, not just in the stark rhetorical ways in which schooling impacted on our colonisation, but actually in the very subtle, intertwined ways in which schools had a role in breaking down our society. For example, in transforming our gender relations, in diminishing the role of rangatira and chiefs. You might think, well, what role did schools have? Or simple, the government demanded that they be on the school committee. And when you're on the school committee, you're basically a master to, at that time, the Department of Education. So, it was seen as the role of chiefs to then get the firewood for the teachers and support the teachers in the Māori schooling system. And so you domesticate many of these roles. School furniture, you might think, what's school furniture got to do with it? Well, there were discussions in the archives about what type of desk was the best desk, so that Māori kids could keep their hands to themselves and would understand property, private property, so they wouldn't push each other and, get inside each other's desks. And, so right down to the design of furniture, space, distance, the distance between the kāinga and the school, that was a discussion. And there was a point in policy where it was decided that schools would be outside the community, the children had to walk to the community, and that was all about separating them from the bad influences of their whānau. So, understanding the subtlety in which colonial education work really helped us understand the subtlety at a larger level of how colonialism works. And then, you know, our work and the work of other scholars abroad has moved more deliberately over time to taking our understandings of education into this decolonizing approach, and really, where New Zealand are world leaders, into developing alternative education. This is another set of titles which really links the development of mana wahine with some of the other alternative feminist writings. Gloria Anzaldúa, Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, Honani K. Trask were all really key writers who helped shape the way we thought about gender relations. And, you know, in some ways they questioned both race, the way that race and gender interplay as ideas, and in the British literature, race, gender, class. So all those dimensions are really important in the way we then sort of produce our own work. I think once again, one of the features of Māori writers is we can go back into our cosmologies, into our own knowledge, and bring a new tradition, or it's an old tradition, but bring that forward as a way of kind of shining the light on the new pathway. That it's not just about rejecting all these other paradigms, it's about saying, well, actually, let's look at ours and bring that through, bearing in mind all these other literatures. This one is just thinks about hauora and, you know, the pioneering work in particular of Mason Dury, who's one of our icons, but also the Māori Women's Welfare League did one of the first big surveys of Māori women's health. And now you see the development of a range of different literatures coming of Māori who are practitioners, the development of kind of Indigenous psychology and other sort of healing strategies. That hopefully what you're beginning to see in these slides are these shifts in knowledge. And this is a more explicit way of putting it. So I've got a simple question. How did we move from hui, written by Anne Salmond, to Whai Kōrero, written by Poia Rewi? How did we move from Richard Benton's survey of Māori language to the book edited by Rawinia Higgins and Poia Rewi around the value of Māori language? How did we move from the work of Elston Best to Rangi Mātāmua's work and recently published book on Matariki? How did we move from this book written by Beres Hua about Māori women to this book by Ngā Huia Taua Kotaku, Mana Wahine Māori? Those moves to me represent a seismic shift in knowledge, and they also represent the way we have come into this space, all right, that we have entered these spaces with our own language, knowledge, culture informing our frameworks. And they're not insignificant journeys, all right? To get from this to this or from Benton to here has been several decades of work. And much of that work, you know, I would put down politically to Kaupapa Māori. Then how do we, you know, take understandings about our tikanga and our values and take that through a range of different disciplines, whether it's marine and freshwater research, some of our environmental urban design, into government policy, and then into data, you know, that we can think about our values, taking this journey and being applied to concepts big data. You know, once again, that's a seismic shift in knowledge and in the, you know, both Kaupapa Māori approaches, but also the decolonizing approach. This slide here is really representing our own sort of political writings, the work, I think, Donna's book, Māori Sovereignty, was pivotal. When it was published, it was so controversial. All right, and I do recommend people go back and read it because it's got full of fabulous quotes that completely upset people, Māori and Pākehā, but needed to be said. You know, now a lot of what people say, you can think, oh, that was, you know, that was written in Māori Sovereignty. When it was written, it was radical. Now you've got to think, is it radical or is it just rhetoric, or have we moved? You know, are we talking about a reality? And similarly, Rangi's book, Ka Whawhai Tonu Mātou, its significance was really, it told the contemporary, what I would say the modern history of Māori and Māori struggle in particular. And then, you know, moving to Miria Barge's work around resistance. Why do I have Ngugi there? Because he wrote that book, Decolonizing the Mind, while he was a visitor here in New Zealand. He was a guest of Pat Hōhepa. And then I think Mason, and amongst a lot of his writings, was his focus always on, you know, the governance issues of New Zealand, the constitutional issues, our role in that. And then there's other radical literature out in which Māori, you know, are contributing as well, which is our connections, not just to each other as Māori, but there is a wider Indigenous struggle out there. Here's some more books. These ones are more explicitly around research and Indigenous research. I actually think they're becoming core texts that you should all read if you're doing research. But I never advise you limit yourself to reading just this. You know, just because you read 100 books on research methods doesn't make you necessarily more expert on method. It just means you've read 100 books. You also need to be reading all this earlier literature I've talked about. You've got to really understand why we're intentional about these matters. It's not just the how-to component, you know, that's important to grasp. It's why. Why do we do that? Why is it important that our voice is there? Why is it important we pay attention? These books help you then look at how, you know, which I think if you're a student, you're more interested in the how. My role is to help you go back to the why. This slide really is just a reminder around policy, that a lot of what we talk about is embedded in policy. Vision Mātauranga is the government policy for government-funded research around the inclusion of Mātauranga Māori in funded research. But it didn't come out of a vacuum. This policy, we're going backwards in time, as well, it's the strategy of the Health Research Council, which has always had a very strong kind of Māori health pathway, to which we can, you know, acknowledge the work of Eru Pōmare and also Mason, Jury and others who helped create that pathway. But this takes us back earlier. I think it's the Hohoeka Declaration for Māori Health Research. And it takes us back to the Marae Hongoeka, where a group of Māori health researchers came together and said, if we're going to get anywhere, we really need to develop an agenda of ourselves, for ourselves. What do we do as Māori health researchers? Where do we want it to go? So I've forgotten, this is like 93, or can look it up, but I think the point I want to make about this is it's about being in control of the agenda of research. You know, we can be at this end here. If you're at this end, you can fill in the box. In this end, you design the box. Actually, I don't like boxes. You design the approach. You design the principles. In this end, you fit in the box, you fill out the box, and hopefully you can do something creative in the box. That's the main point I want to make about that. So I want to turn now and talk to Joeliee about her processes and about, I guess, how you went about understanding Kaupapa Māori research when it came to doing your thesis. So hopefully you've had 10 minutes to think about it. And, you know, just go back to the beginning of what you did.
Cool. Well, for those of you who don't know, Linda is was my chief supervisor for my PhD. And one of the wonderful things about being Linda's student is about getting dumped in at last minute. So I think we were having a chat about this in the car, and I think even listening to your kōrero this morning, I was thinking about, there's lots about what I did that's quite similar to that journey of learning that she was talking about in terms of how did Kaupapa Māori come about. And I think I was really resistant. I think I was creative, stubborn, all of those things. And at the start, although I did Kaupapa Māori for my master's, that at the start, I probably was starting from ground zero. And so what I did was under Linda's, at our first supervision for me, I remember you said to me, just go and read a lot, go and read philosophy and figure out what methodology is from your perspective, what it is in Te Ao Māori, what are our words for it. And my mind was like, and I went away and thought, okay. And so that's what I really did. I started with what are these words? What do they mean? What are they in te reo? What do they mean for me in my own grounding and taranakitanga? What are our versions of those? How do we view research and methods of inquiry and that kind of thing? And I think too, coming from Māori studies background, that I had a strong sense of understanding the power of our mātauranga, but I wasn't sure perhaps around the political aspects of things and around how Indigenous peoples were approaching research and our relationships and commonalities with them. So I really started with looking at the literature and then checking in with Linda, and quite often what would happen is I'd talk for about 30 minutes and she'd go, okay, well, yep, that's great. But what about this? And then honestly, it'd take me 3 months to think, what did she mean? But it was about that. It was about having those conversations to bounce back with key people. Yeah, really good friends in the area that I talked to and bounced off about it. And then also I think, and then I was thinking about the ethics and the ethics and the values that I had as a person, but that I also thought were important to research and were in the literature. And then it was thinking around, okay, so Kaupapa Māori, how am I going to push it? Maybe it's Kaupapa Taranaki, then how am I going to push it? Maybe it's Kaupapa whānau, then maybe it's Kaupapa Joeliee, no, come back. So it was all those kinds of things. Kind of go circular about it, but certainly thinking about ethics. I like what Moana Jackson talked about, that ethic of prior thought. Talked about that at the first seminar, and that got me thinking about all those, all of our moteatea, ori, and thinking about, okay, those are amazing sources of knowledge. How can I include those in my literature review? Part of those things were informing, those values and ethics were informing how I went about understanding Kaupapa Māori approach, and then the political aspects of it and the critical questions, and how could I pose a question that I knew was going to be empowering for our people and validating. So
If I remember, you took ages, months, years to write your Kaupapa Māori chapter.
I did. Yeah, you
want to talk about that?
I think I wanted to get it right, really.
Yeah.
I wanted to get it right, and it's kind of my process is to make sure I read everything, which you can't, but I tried. And then talk to lots of people, pose ideas, you know, what is Mātauranga Māori? What are the boundaries of it? What are the, all those kinds of things. Make sure, and then what I did was actually, it was like, okay, Joeliee, get on with it. It's been 3 years. And so I had to go out and start doing the research. And really, when the two come together, you get a better understanding of what it is that informed the methods that you chose, what it is that informed your methodology. And then when it comes to writing it up, I was able to see clearly. So that's how we came to, in my thesis, I talked about theorising home and using some of the symbols of resistance that we have back home in Parihaka and using them in my research. And then thinking about things like reciprocity or takoha mai takoha to how could I make this research beneficial for my whānau.
One of the questions I remember you asking was, how did you know your research was going to be transformative?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it was a big question. You also said to me, how can we measure it? I was like, really struck by that. I think, I don't know if I still have the answer other than to say it's about having that as a goal, and then that your methodology, your theory informs you walking toward that goal. And ako for me was a big component in that, and exploring the concept of ako, the principle of ako. In research.
I think you had another question too, if I recall, which is whether you had read all the literature, I remember, and very impressive, your reading, and you had a good solid sort of sense of the history of Kaupapa Māori, but you were also still asking, but is this it? Like, is there more? Is there something you haven't read? Or
that's right. Yeah. And I think I was also asking, something you said to me was, but what's beyond this? Like, where do we take it? And I was always like, but this seems to be it. Like, I don't know how to make it more or where to take it, what the trajectory is, what the future is.
And then that gets to one of your core questions was, what can I add?
Yeah,
remember
big
that?
Question.
I remember you asking.
I think that's what took so long.
Add?
Yeah, what am I going to add? How am I going to
add it? Yeah,
I hope so.
Yeah. You've added in lots of different ways, and I think that's a good illustration of, I can't tell you.
No, and you often did that. You would drop your little pearls, of wisdom.
You have to go.
Yeah, and I think, although
I can put some things in your kit.
Which you did.
That feed you along the way.
Yeah. But then I had to take it and go, okay,
steps.
Where am I kinaki to eat with this? What am I? Where am I going to eat it? How am I going to eat it? Yeah.
And then you take it that further. And I think that's really important that younger researchers realise, you can take it further, but we can't tell you.
No.
Because we don't know what that looks like. You know, and you've got to make that step with confidence, I think. Well, sometimes it's a blindness and
for a while,
but then you make it and you consolidate it. So I think that's good.
Ka pai.
Okay.
All right. So are you ready to move
I think we're ready to move to questions now. And I'll just have a little sip of coffee here.
Okay. Just having a look at our chat box. Okay, so we have a question from here saying, how should one approach utilising song compositions as a method? Would this fall under the Pūrākau methodology?
Say it again, would it?
How should one approach utilising song compositions as a method? Maybe that could be the first
So I think that's question one.
Yeah.
I'm sure it is a method. If there's a method in composition, if there's a structure of composition, if there are ideas about how you begin, how you get through the middle and how you end, then there's a method. And I think it's trying to extract then the principles of that method, so it's not too literal, into then how you might begin to practice and use that. I mean, I'm assuming you're talking about particular more tea or more traditional songs that in them are journeys. Some of them actually they're a journey anyway, and it's how do you understand the way a journey is structured to be able to apply that to a method, and I'm sure there's a method. Would this fall under the Pūrākau methodology? Well, it could, but it also could be its own methodology.
Yeah.
You just have to figure out what that is and name it as such. Yeah.
Ka pai. You have the power to make sense of what you read. Okay, so we just have lots of comments there. Some comment there is a great reminder to keep ethical practice at the forefront of your research, whether with your own whānau or others. Yeah, ka pai. And a note there, the power you have as a researcher is to ask questions. That is your power. Yeah, yeah, ka pai.
Well, and to observe, to always be, trained researchers are very powerful observers. And I know, sometimes I have to kind of switch that off because as a social science researcher, you observe people all the time. And sort of, so if I'm sitting quietly at a hui, chances are I'm observing. But what you do with that is, some of it is you just store it up, and others you are using because you are in a research project.
I was thinking about when I was a student and thinking about, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I was thinking about how I often wondered about this thing decolonizing and what it really means. So some might say, does it mean being anti-colonial? Does it mean, can we ever truly decolonize? Wondered if you could talk a little bit about that itself.
Well, I think by naming it as something, it's trying to acknowledge what our political situation is and not pretend that it's something else, So then the issue is, how then do we understand our circumstances and seek to change them? To me, the decolonial is anti-colonial. Some people would describe themselves as post-colonial, but most Indigenous scholars we don't see ourselves as post-colonial because that assumes the post is over, that colonialism is over. I think both the decolonial and anti-colonial are saying, actually, there is a huge lot of political work we need to do. And, never be frightened of dreaming the impossible dream, because a lot of what we've achieved is because we've continued to dream that we could do it. You look at kohanga and kura now, they're so well established. Our undergraduate students think they were always there. They were always there, and I'm thinking, oh no, actually, real people really had to struggle hard to develop these institutions that you can now take for granted. And when we were struggling for kura in particular, it was seen as impossible. Like, you didn't have this, you couldn't do this, how could you do this? You can't teach physics, you can't teach this, you won't be able to teach this, there's no rule for that. But it just went on and on, like endless arguments that keep us down. Whereas we were saying, well, so what? We'll start with where we are and we'll create that language. And I think that's where you just make that stand and you go for it.
Kapai, do we have some questions? Okay. What methodology is needed to unpack the culture of internalized superiority that continues our oppression?
Superiority that contributes to this.
Contributes to this oppression.
What methodology is needed to unpack the culture of internalized superiority? You mean of the oppressor or our own internal superiority?
I think they mean the oppressor.
I mean the oppressor. Well, that's the whole sort of whether you start at the constitution or work your way down to the, basic practice. Some people who work in that space would be all about sort of partnership and relationships and that sort of transformative stuff. But, where you've got to look at where has it actually worked? Where do we work well with others? And to be frank, it's when we control our own pathway, our own spaces. That's how it is at the moment. We don't quite have those idealised bicultural situations where we can work together equally. Some do. There's some organisations that have worked hard on developing sort of bicultural governance, but see, I don't see biculturalism as this equivocational equivalence of like 5 here, 5 there, one president and another president. I don't see it as that. I see it more as just the very nature of how everyday decisions are made, everyday practice is created. And in a way, those are new sort of spaces, because the other challenge is how do you work in great constructive ways with non-Māori, but also how do you also continue to develop and enhance our ways of living, our value system. Otherwise our value system is feeding this other sort of strategy and programs, and we're not growing as a people. We're just feeding this hungry beast, and we have to feed ourselves. We have to nourish ourselves, and that in itself is a challenge. And I don't think there's an easy recipe for that, to do that.
Another question we have here is from Wanarariri. Ngā mihi, Linda. You mentioned earlier that Kaupapa Māori can be applied in the quantitative space. Yep. How do you see it in regards to drawing on secondary data sources that one doesn't have control over?
Yes, I've just read something about that. I think it's always the framing of that question. Why? What is it about that secondary data that has some possibilities for you? What is it that you're interested in? I think when I was at NASA, I sat in a session where some Aboriginal researchers were using that from the Australian data pool, and it was difficult because for a number of questions they kept saying, we didn't have control of that, we couldn't ask that question, but they did have control of the way they approached the secondary data that they were using. And in other words, this is data that's already been collected for whatever other purposes, and they're coming in and analysing it from a particular focal point. In this case, an Indigenous one, or it could be a Māori one. It doesn't really matter whether it's quantitative or qualitative. Using secondary data is going to be tricky, and having the right set of questions, and then being clear about the constraints. I think that's about all you can do. You might, if you're lucky, see something that's been overlooked, or you might find a pearl, but generally speaking, that doesn't happen. You often are constrained by the limits of that primary data. And often you go, I wish they'd asked this, but they didn't.
There's another question here which I really like, and we talked about this before, but could you talk a little bit about what you see as being the difference between what some might call as a Mātauranga Māori approach versus a Kaupapa Māori approach, or if there is a versus?
I don't think there are versus. I think Kaupapa Māori was, in terms of research, was developed to enable all kinds of research, including Mātauranga Māori and thinking about Mātauranga Māori. I think that's often posed, if you like, as also a Māori studies approach versus a other social science and science disciplinary approach to knowledge. But I don't see them as contradictory. But I've just co-written a paper with Po Temara, Kahotu Maxwell and Hopai Puke, where, we think about these issues of Mātauranga Māori, what does that mean? And, a good Kaupapa Māori researcher is always thinking about implications of whatever we do, and even the implications of working in Kaupapa Māori spaces and Mātauranga Māori. What does it mean? That's our big question. Where is it taking us? How is it transformative? How do we understand benefits? What is the impact of our research? Those, to me, are the questions that drive us all the time. We can't always answer them simply, and sometimes you can't even ask that question because it's too early to ask it. It's like someone is trying to grow a little plant called Kaupapa Māori, and then someone else comes and stands on it with a big gumboot and says, well, you didn't do this, and what about this, and what about this? We've got to be able to let things grow and understand then how they can flourish, or, if they grow a little bit crooked, then think, well, what does that mean? How do we, what's gone wrong? How do we correct it? How do we develop it? That tends to be how I think. I thought there was an interesting question up a bit around, can I use Kaupapa Māori methodology?
And have a non-Māori
technically you can. Everyone can. And it often happens.
And you did, right? You had non-Māori
I had not, but I didn't write about Kaupapa Māori in my PhD.
Right.
Yeah. But I had 2 non-Māori supervisors who basically encouraged me to think it through, and to do it in a both a robust way academically, but they allowed me to be creative as well. The fact is, a lot of our young researchers are coming through doing Kaupapa Māori approaches in their research and having non-Māori supervisors. So it happens. The challenge, I think, to ensure that your Kaupapa Māori methodology is rigorous is to actually have a Māori person or researcher who can give you some guidance in that space. And there are some sort of little bells you need to think about when they go off, that those are signals to do something. For example, Kaupapa Māori is, as I said, it's not just morphing itself into Māori-friendly research. Kaupapa Māori is not just a cynical means to get access to community and then you use another method. It's an approach that, to me, should strengthen you as a young researcher, even if you have a non-Māori supervisor. But I do know from the stories of some students that there are some non-Māori supervisors who are really antagonistic to Kaupapa Māori. And in that situation, I think you're really up against it.
Yep.
I think you do need to seek someone who allows and encourages you. I mean, I had 2 Pākehā men. One was an Englishman, Roger Dale, and one was a New Zealand Pākehā, Stuart McNaughton. Generous, compassionate, encouraging, and asked respectful questions all the time. And everyone deserves those qualities in a supervisor. If you get someone who's mingy, mean, nasty, negative, then you've got the wrong supervisor.
And I think, we've got a little bit of time left, but I had another question. I was thinking about some of the recent, perhaps PhD work that you've been privy to that has excited you in terms of where can you see Kaupapa Māori moving and changing and evolving?
Well, what I see out of Kaupapa Māori, it's like the literature that I just showed you. This burgeoning of ideas and developments across a range of dimensions. And, if the role of Kaupapa Māori, one of its transformative roles is to create a space and open up a possibility, then I think we've achieved that in that sense. But then where does it take us? That's like the next generation and the next generation. There are some ongoing political struggles, legitimacy issues. There are a lot of Māori who don't use Kaupapa Māori, and there are a lot of students even who have anxieties about Kaupapa Māori, that if I use this, then it means this. And all I can say is, take your Kaupapa Māori method in your research and you go overseas and you go to conferences and you work in Indigenous, go to Indigenous conferences and broaden your ideas, but also keep yourself grounded. Someone who speaks all around the world, I never see myself as disconnected from who I am and where I'm from. That's my strength, that's my identity, that keeps me real and keeps me grounded always. Where I'm from, who I'm from, the land I'm from. And, I just think it's really important to not run away from yourself, not get stuck up and arrogant. There's always work to be done. And everyone also comes from somewhere, right? They also have tipuna and they also have whenua. And it's about respecting that and then sort of developing. The researcher I'm now is not the researcher I was when I started. And I started doing research before I did my PhD. All right, so you learn to be a researcher. That's why researchers often continue in it, because it's fun. You're always learning, you're always developing, you're always getting new ideas, and you're always exploring different kinds of methods. So it's not a sort of finite pool of knowledge that you exhaust and then that's it. It'll grow.
So do we have any more questions coming through? I don't think we do. No. So I think that we're rounding up at the moment. I think I just wanted to conclude, as Linda was talking, I was thinking about some of the strategies that I employed while I was, it's a bit weird to say while I was finishing my PhD, because I just sent the PDF off to the binders this morning, so it is in the past tense. But while I was on that journey, that actually forums like this webinar, particularly the YouTube clips, Linda will hate this, but I would Google her, Linda Tuhiwai Smith, and all these YouTube clips come up. And you can literally, I recommend it, you can see her presentations all around the world. And what I loved about, these kinds of forums is that you can watch them later and you can reflect on them and make notes, and that's what I suggest that you all do. So if you can watch it back later, watch the one previously with Naomi Simmons and Seed-Pihama, and then watch the next two, which are with Joeliee Morgan and Gillian Tipene as a discussant, and then after that with Tahu Kukutai and Mohirua as a discussant. I think if you can watch those and then watch them again and reflect on yourself, the methodology that you think that you're employing, and ask those critical questions about where does the power lie, am I asking the right question, what are my ethics, who is this benefiting, all those key questions that Linda talked about, and then make some notes for yourself. I think this is a really important forum for that. So I'd just like to thank Linda again for your amazing kōrero as always, and to Rau Matatini for hosting us, and again to our sponsors, Ngā Pai o Te Māramatanga, and to all the students who are watching as part of the Mai Te Kupenga Ropu. Nei rā te mihi kia koutou katoa. Nā reira, kia ora tātou.